Hey everyone, so my name is Emily and I am the Assistive Technology Coordinator in UCD Access and Lifelong Learning. Today we're going to be looking at accessible PowerPoint presentations. Okay, so what we're going to cover is what do we mean by an accessible presentation, steps to make presentations more accessible, so practical things that you can start doing today, and then how to deliver inclusive presentations. So what do we mean when we say digital accessibility? So one thing to keep in mind is under the EU Web Accessibility Directive, any material that we are hosting online, whether that be on our website or on our Brightspace, needs to be what we call WCAG compliant. So that's Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and it needs to meet those standards. Now, for members of faculty, what we have built into Brightspace is a tool called Ally. And what it does is it gives you an automated score on WCAG compliance and steps that you can take to make your content more accessible. Okay, so the other element of digital accessibility that we need to think about, the main principle, is equity of access to digital information. So what we mean by that is someone should be able to access content to a similar standard, regardless of whether they're on a mobile phone, whether they are on a desktop, and whether they're using assistive technologies. So things like a screen reader for people who are visually impaired or blind, or read aloud technologies. So we'd actually have a lot of students who prefer to listen to written content. Another way of thinking about digital accessibility is universality of digital design. So that would be the likes of our universal design for learning principles. So that's multiple means of representation, multiple means of expression, and multiple means of engagement. And really what all of this boils down to when we're talking about digital accessibility is freedom. So can someone access the content independently without any additional intervention? So I mentioned our Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and these are actually distilled down into the acronym CORE. So perceivable, is the information clear? So for presentations, we're thinking about our color contrast, we're thinking about our font, and under UDL, that would be our multiple means of representation. Is it operable? So with our PowerPoints, our presentations, if someone were to access that content, would they be able to click through it easily? Would they be able to understand the layout? So keep in mind, not everyone uses a mouse. Some people access information via keyboard or via voice control. Is it understandable? So if we're using technologies in our presentation, so maybe if we're using a Kahoot or we're using a Padlet, is it clear to people how to access those? And then, is it robust? So that's what we're talking about with if we're sharing lecture slides with students. Would they work well on a mobile device? So keep in mind actually that statistically, most UCD students access Brightspace on a mobile device like a phone or a tablet. Okay. So some really basic design choices that we can all start doing today with our presentations is to keep things simple. So remember, our PowerPoints are there to support our ideas. They're not meant to be the star of the show. So really strip it down to the bare bones in terms of content. We should be using sans serif fonts. And what we mean by sans serif is no curly bits. So things like Calibri or Arial or Helvetica, because what actually happens with serif fonts is it makes it harder for the eye to scan the letter. So for people with visual impairments, for people with specific learning difficulties such as dyslexia, and keeping in mind that dyslexia is the most commonly registered disability in Irish higher education just generally, it's best to stick with sans serif fonts. Similarly, we should be avoiding italics or bold text for large quantities of information. And then when we're thinking about font size, we're going for a minimum of 24, okay? So if we need to make this font smaller, we probably have too much information on the slide. Color contrast is actually the biggest accessibility challenge that comes up on our Brightspace Ally scores, okay? So it's our biggest accessibility issue. And thankfully, it's actually quite easy to fix. So when we're thinking about color contrast, we're actually thinking about the brightness of the colors. So rather than thinking that pink and blue would be a good color contrast, we're actually thinking more in terms of black and white, okay? So with, for instance, diagrams, a good way of actually checking the color contrast, so if we've got, say, graphs, is to consider printing them in grayscale and seeing, can you still differentiate between the bars or the segments on the pie chart? Similarly, we have tools to help us check our color contrast, okay? So the one I've got on the screen here is called the WebAIM Contrast Checker, and it's an automated tool that applies our WCAG guidelines. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to exit out of my main screen share and actually show you how you can get what we call the hex codes, which is the individual code for a particular color in order to use the contrast checker. So you see, I've got an example on the screen here of what is per color contrast. And what I'm going to do is I can get my hex codes. So I'm going to highlight my text. You see, I've got my color here. What I'm going to do is if I go to more colors, custom, it's going to tell me my hex code. So it starts with hashtag, and then it's made up of F's and O's. And I can do the same thing as well for the fill of my text box. What I would then do is I would copy and paste this information into the WebAIM contrast checker, and it's going to tell me if it meets WCAG compliance. And it'll also tell me what would happen if I were to bold the text. So would that change the outcomes? Generally speaking, it doesn't. The other thing to say is that under the review tab, we have a really helpful accessibility checker built into Microsoft software. And it uses a similar system to Ally in that it takes the WCAG guidelines and it automatically checks. And what it'll do is it'll actually bring you through your document and flag any accessibility issues to you and the steps that you can take in order to correct them. So I'm going to say on this layout, just as we talk about document structure, okay? So with PowerPoints, we don't have headings per se, but what we do have are the automated blocks. So if I go to insert and I go to new slide, you can see that I have slides with titles, and actually these little boxes act as headings on my PowerPoint, okay? Now, it's really important that our documents do have inbuilt structures, so our headings and our layers of text, because if someone was, say, using a screen reader, this is what they would use to navigate the document. Similarly, if we had a student who wanted to listen to the document, it's really important that within the document structure, we flag what is a title and what is main text, okay? Similarly, when we're thinking about giving our slides titles, they should all have different names, okay? So for someone who's using a screen reader, so someone who perhaps has a visual impairment, what they can do to decide if they want to skip ahead in a PowerPoint is just listen to the document, the slide titles, okay? Rather than having to go through and click into each document page, okay? The other thing we need to keep in mind with our slides is our reading order, okay? So if a student, for instance, wanted to use the Ally document conversion, so say they were a student who is commuting and they wanted to be able to listen to this file as an MP3, it's really important that it has a clear document structure. So what order do we intend for someone to be able to read this page? So you can see on this page, I've got my title, I've got my text, and I've got my image. Now, reading order in PowerPoint can often depend on when we put in different objects. So for instance, if I'd actually not used the heading function and I'd put this in after writing my main text, there's a good chance that the main text would be ahead of this title in the reading order. And I can check my reading order by going to Review, check Accessibility, Reading Order pane, and you can see on this side here, it tells me the order that my slide components are currently showing. So you can see this is in the right order. It's in the right order because I've used the actual built-in title box. It's then got my text box, and then here it's also got my image. So I've got the Fixture Content Day logo. And just as a wee reminder, we're taking part in Ally Fixture Content Day on the 18th of May, and we'll be holding workshops in the Access and Lifelong Learning Centre to help people work through their Ally documents on Brightspace and make quick and easy accessibility improvements. Okay, so we're going to go back to our main display. So another thing to keep in mind when we are making accessible presentations is alternative text. So alternative text is a brief description of an image, and it is basically in place of the image itself. So for someone who is blind or has a visual impairment, it lets them know the content of an image, but it will also show up if someone maybe has a poor internet connection. Okay, so instead of using extra data in order to display an image, it will show the brief text that you've given to describe it. Or if someone was using the alternative formats on Ally, so the likes of the MP3 files, instead of hearing image with no description, which is the default if alt text isn't applied, they'd hear a brief description of the image instead. Okay. So to add alt text, what we're going to do is on PowerPoint, we would right click on the image and it'll say add alternative text. Same for if you're using the likes of Google Slides. For Apple products, we would go to format and descriptions. Just to keep in mind, because conference season is around the corner, if you're using Twitter, there is also the option of adding alt text to any images, and you can actually turn on automatic reminders. So whenever you add a picture to a tweet, it'll give you a wee nudge to add your alt text. And then if you're in mathematical discipline, so maybe if you're in maths or physics or engineering and you're working with Beamer, so if you need to be putting LaTeX into your content, just keep in mind that when you export Beamer slides to a PDF, they do lose their alt text and they lose document tagging. So there's a really great blog from UCL that just talks about some of the issues with PDFs made using LaTeX. But a workaround for alt text would be to have really clear captions with any images that you're adding in. So our alt text checklist, and again, I'm going to just exit out of the main presentation. Consider the context of the image. Okay, so why are you using it? So if I had, say, a picture of students in a lab, the alt text that I would be writing for the UCD prospectus is probably going to be quite different to the alt text that I'd be writing for a presentation on lab safety. I'd be focusing on different elements. Similarly, be brief with your alt text. So a thing to keep in mind is that screen reader users are listening to information all day, every day, okay? So it's really important that we cut to the chase. Why is the image there? Equally, always end your alt text with a full stop, okay? So that gives a little bit of a pause before the next set of content begins being read out. With alt text, you don't need to say a picture of the UCD logo or a picture of a dog, okay? Screen readers by default will announce that there is a picture, okay? The exception to this would be the type of picture that we're posting. So if I'm using, say, a screen grab from a piece of software, I'm going to specify that. I'm also going to name the software. Or if I maybe have a cartoon on the page, I'm going to specify that it is a cartoon. The other thing to keep in mind is not every image actually needs alternative text. So if an image is just there to fill in the space or to add a wee bit of interest and jazz up a slide, you can mark it as decorative, and that's what I'm going to do here. So you'll see I've got the UCD logo. It's not really adding anything to my presentation. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to view alt text, and you'll see we've got a wee checkbox here that says mark as decorative. And what that does is it actually just takes the image out of the reading order. Okay, so it's no longer announced by a screen reader, it's just ignored. Okay, and it's better to do that than to have an image with no alternative text, because what will happen otherwise is the screen reader or the MP3 conversion will just read the file name. So someone could end up with just a stream of random letters and numbers and then .jpeg. So it's better just to mark it as decorative and leave it off. Okay. So thinking about live presentations, really we should have captions when we're presenting. Now, it's sometimes easier said than done. On Zoom here, you can actually turn on live captions on your toolbar. Now, keep in mind, these are automated, so they're not going to be perfect, okay, especially with my accent, but that is an option. And if you choose to record presentations on Zoom, you'll then actually get a transcript that you can add if you want to share the lecture or the presentation online. And then we also have Yuja in Brightspace, and that links in with Zoom. And again, it generates automated captions. Now, what I will say, and what I will be doing after this presentation, is actually editing the transcript, okay? So for things like place names or technical terms, the automated captions aren't perfect. They are getting better, but it's always really important just to look over them and make sure that they make sense. The other option, if you're presenting on PowerPoint, is that you can actually turn on live captions. So you can see here, there's a wee checkbox that says always use subtitles. And if I click that, it will start captioning what I'm saying. Now, I generally find the Zoom captions are a bit better than the PowerPoint captions. And another challenge with PowerPoint is if I were pre-recording a lecture, recording in PowerPoint doesn't actually save the live captions. Now, if you are hosting an event, so maybe you've got some local conferences coming up, I would recommend a human captioner, okay? It's the most accurate way to do captioning. And it's also a signpost to anyone who's coming to the conference that their needs are going to be met and that they're welcome. So keep it in mind, captions aren't just helpful for people who are hard of hearing, they can also be helpful for people who have processing difficulties. Maybe the hall is a bit loud, maybe they've got a bit distracted. Live captions are a really good way of making sure that everyone feels included. Just a couple of other notes on how we can make our live presentations more inclusive. So where possible, I would suggest providing your slides. Okay, so for students, when we're lecturing, a lot of students use note-taking softwares where they actually annotate the slides. So it's helpful for them to have them in advance. It means they can write their notes directly onto the slides. For students with visual impairments, it's really important so that they can magnify the slides. And for students who are hard of hearing, having the slides in advance gives them a little bit of context as to what to expect in the lecture. Similarly, with lectures, and presentations, we should be describing any visual elements on the page, okay? The reason for this is you might have someone who's at the back of the room and can't see very clearly, or you might have someone who has a visual impairment, okay? So if you have any graphs on the page, really important just to describe the key elements. And then if you're using any interactive tools, so things like Kahoot or Padlet, first thing to do is to actually check that they're compliant with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. This is a way of making sure that if someone were using a mobile device, or if someone uses assistive technologies like a screen reader or keyboard access or magnification, that the tool is actually going to work with how they engage with digital material. Where possible, it's helpful to warn participants of technologies that we're going to be using in advance. Okay, so if you know that during a module you're going to be doing Kahoot quizzes a fair wee bit, signpost that on the Brightspace so that folk can have a little look and have a practice before they get into lectures. Not everyone is super comfortable with new technologies, and it'll also save time in class. Similarly, don't assume that a Kahoot or a Padlet is going to be really quick and easy, okay? Particularly when people are in big groups, they can get flustered. So build that time in to support anyone to access any educational technology tools that you're wanting to use in a presentation environment. And then also make sure that you're offering people multiple ways to engage with the technology. So you'll see on this slide, I have included a sample of how I would be introducing a piece of educational technology. So what I've got is I would have the QR code for folk who maybe want access via a mobile phone. And then I would also have the code to access the Padlet, a description of where to type that in. So you might link to the App Store, or you might link to the Padlet main page. And then a direct URL to my Padlet where I want people to post. And in doing that, I've given people different ways to engage with my content. I'd also maybe suggest, particularly if it's in a class, that students can work together. Okay, so it might be that someone doesn't have a mobile device. It might be that you have a student with disability who finds it hard to quickly engage with new technologies, or it might be that you just have someone who doesn't feel super comfortable working with technologies by themselves. So within this, we're giving people lots of different ways to participate. And then just one last note. I know some people prefer to provide their PowerPoint slides via PDF. Okay, one thing to keep in mind with PDFs is that they're not what we would call reflowable. And what that means is that they don't resize easily to new devices. So they're not great for viewing on mobile phones, for instance. Okay. Other thing to say is PDFs don't fully protect intellectual property. Okay. If someone wants to edit a PDF, they can convert it to a different file format. They can also use Adobe to edit a PDF. So it doesn't protect intellectual property. What it can do is create accessibility difficulties for folk who use assistive technologies, and also folk who don't use assistive technologies. So you might have someone who needs a slightly bigger font size, someone who likes to use a dyslexia-friendly font, or someone who maybe has color blindness and they just need to be able to customize the text on the PowerPoint. By putting them into PDF, we make it very hard for people to make these small changes that they require. If you do want to convert to PDF, first step with a PowerPoint is to check the accessibility. So if I go to the Review tab, click Check Accessibility, and I get feedback on small changes I can make to make my PowerPoint more accessible. So you can see here, it's linking me back to the example that I used for a hard to read color contrast. Okay, you can see it's also giving me an explanation as to why I need to fix my color contrast. The other thing to say with converting PowerPoints to PDF is that you need to do it using PowerPoint rather than Google Slides. Okay, so Google Slides and Google Docs, when we export to PDF, they don't keep the structure of the document. So they lose alternative text. They also lose document headings. Okay, so it becomes what we call an untagged PDF. On Ally, those automatically get a red score because it makes it very hard for people to navigate the document, and it makes it hard for screen readers or conversions to MP3 to read the text in the correct structure, in the correct order. Okay. If you're using Beamer, as I mentioned, those documents aren't tagged. Okay. So full explanation on LaTeX and the challenges of PDF tagging is linked in my slides, which I'll put up on the UC All website. But that is something to keep in mind. And what I've got actually is a video on accessible PDFs where I do talk about workarounds if you use LaTeX for writing your PowerPoints. And also if you like to sort of give your lecture notes in PDF format, ways that you can make sure that they're definitely going to be inclusive. Okay, and then just on a final note, as I mentioned, 18th of May is Ally Fix Your Content Day. It's also Global Accessibility Awareness Day. So we'll be having a coffee morning in the Access and Lifelong Learning Centre. And then we'll also be doing more of these workshops. And I'll also be doing a drop-in service. So if anyone wants any one-to-one help with making their content more inclusive, I'd love to help with that.